A racist Karen calls the cops on a black family's BBQ, accusing them of being suspicious. But when the officers realize the father is the new police chief, everything changes, and what happens next will leave you in awe. Don't miss this moment of justice. The scent of hickory-smoked ribs drifted through the air, mingling with the sounds of laughter and sizzling meat. The Johnson family was in their element. James stood over the grill, flipping burgers with the practiced ease of a man who had spent countless weekends perfecting his craft. Lisa arranged the side dishes on a folding picnic table, while their two children, Malik and Ava, ran barefoot through the soft grass, playing tag with the neighbors' kids. The park was alive with weekend joy. Families sprawled across picnic blankets, children shrieking as they chased each other near the playground, the occasional bark of a dog from the nearby walking trail. It was a picture of community, of belonging, but not everyone saw it that way. From the other side of the park, Karen watched with narrowed eyes. A tight-lipped scowl stretched across her face as she clutched her overpriced handbag. Her sharp features twisted in disapproval as she surveyed the scene in front of her. Black families laughing, music playing, joy radiating in a space she considered hers. She muttered under her breath, shifting on the park bench like she was itching for an excuse to intervene. "Look at them, taking over the whole place," she grumbled. "This used to be such a nice neighborhood." Karen wasn't just annoyed, she was enraged. Enraged that the park, which she had always seen as an extension of her community, was being enjoyed by them. Her fingers tightened around the phone in her manicured hand as she muttered, "I won't stand for this." Then, with stiff determination, she stood up and marched toward the Johnson family. James noticed her approach but didn't react immediately. He had dealt with people like her before. He continued tending to the grill, flipping a perfectly charred rack of ribs while keeping an eye on his wife and kids. Karen stopped a few feet away, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her expression was pinched, like she had just stepped in something vile. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice laced with irritation. Lisa turned from setting up the table, wiping her hands on a napkin. "Yes?" Karen's eyes flickered over the setup, the well-stocked picnic table, the folding chairs, the gleaming grill. Her lip curled. "You people aren't supposed to be here." Lisa's brow furrowed. "I'm sorry, what?" Karen sighed dramatically, as if she were the one being inconvenienced. "This is a public park, not a hip-hop concert," she said, waving a dismissive hand toward the Bluetooth speaker playing old-school R&B. "You're making a scene." Lisa inhaled sharply, but kept her tone calm. "Ma'am, we reserved this picnic space ahead of time. We have a permit." Karen let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Oh, I highly doubt that. You people always find a way to bend the rules, don't you?" James finally turned from the grill, his jaw tightening. "There's no problem here. We're just enjoying the afternoon with our family, same as everyone else." Karen's gaze flicked to James. Her eyes scanned him, his strong, composed stance, his neatly pressed casual clothes. Something about his quiet confidence unnerved her. "Look," she said, shifting her weight. "I don't feel safe, okay? There are a lot of you here, and it's making people uncomfortable." Lisa let out a dry laugh. "People? Or just you?" Karen's face darkened. "I don't need to explain myself. I know trouble when I see it." She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. The movement was exaggerated, dramatic, designed to show them that she was in control. "You know what? I think I'll let the police handle this." Lisa stepped forward, her voice tinged with frustration. "You don't need to do that. We've done nothing wrong." Karen smirked as she tapped the screen. "Oh, there is. Let's see what the police have to say about this." Malik and Ava, who had been giggling moments ago, now stood frozen. Their wide, frightened eyes darted between their parents and the angry woman on the phone. James exhaled slowly, keeping his voice measured. "Ma'am, there's no need for that." Karen ignored him, holding the phone to her ear. Yes, I need officers at Hillside Park. There's a group here, being loud, aggressive. She cut herself off, dramatically gasping. Oh my God, they're getting hostile. I think they might be up to something illegal. Lisa's hands curled into fists. Are you serious? Karen turned away slightly, lowering her voice just enough to make it sound more urgent. I don't feel safe, she whispered. They're surrounding me. James's fingers twitched at his sides. He had heard that lie too many times before. A muscle ticked in his jaw. He could already predict what would happen next. Police officers arriving with hands on their holsters, suspicion in their eyes, sizing up the threat that Karen had fabricated. Lisa shot him a look, worry flickering across her face. Not again. Malik, barely 10 years old, tugged on his father's shirt. His voice was small. Are we going to be okay, Daddy? James swallowed hard, then looked down at his son with a reassuring smile. We're going to be just fine, buddy. Karen, still pretending to be distressed, stepped away, phone pressed to her ear. Yes, please hurry, she urged. Then she turned back toward them, a triumphant gleam in her eye. The police are on their way, she announced, folding her arms smugly. Let's see what they have to say about this. James exhaled through his nose, his shoulders squared. He had spent years fighting for justice, for accountability, for change. But no matter how far he had come, how much he had achieved, it always came back to this. He wasn't just any black man at a BBQ. He was Chief James Johnson, newly appointed head of the city's police department. And Karen had just made the biggest mistake of her life. James Johnson had spent his entire career fighting for a system that didn't always fight for him. From the moment he stepped into law enforcement, he knew he had to be twice as good, twice as patient, and twice as careful as his white counterparts. There were officers who had respected him, even admired his work ethic. But there were just as many who saw him as an outsider, a black man daring to wear the badge in a world that wasn't built for him. Yet, against the odds, he had risen through the ranks, determined to change the system from within. Just 2 months ago, he had been sworn in as the new chief of police, the first black man to ever hold the position in their city. His appointment had been met with both praise and resistance. To the public, he was a symbol of progress, a leader committed to bridging the gap between the police and the people. But behind closed doors, there were still those who doubted him, those who resented seeing him in charge. James had dealt with subtle slights all his life, his authority questioned, his competence second-guessed. But the worst part wasn't how people treated him. It was how people like Karen treated his family. Lisa saw it all the time. She had watched her husband pour everything into his work, yet no matter how high he climbed, he was still seen as just another black man in the eyes of people like Karen. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her husband was the most powerful law enforcement officer in the city, yet a white woman's phone call could still put him at risk. And what about their children? That was Lisa's biggest fear. Malik was 10, Ava was 7, still young enough to believe in the fairness of the world. But Lisa knew it wouldn't last. One day her son's innocent joy would be mistaken for defiance. One day her daughter's confidence would be seen as an attitude problem. And one day, someone like Karen might call the police on them when James wasn't around to protect them. Lisa had tried to shield them from the ugliness, but it was impossible. The world had a way of creeping in, even when you weren't looking for it, especially now, as their neighborhood was changing. For years their city had been quietly shifting. More black families were moving into areas that had once been predominantly white. It wasn't gentrification. It was simply people finding better opportunities, better homes, better schools for their kids. But not everyone welcomed the change. People like Karen saw it as an invasion. She and others like her spoke in coded language, complaints about property values and keeping the neighborhood safe. But James and Lisa knew what they really meant. The truth was, Karen didn't care about noise or permits or safety. She cared about control. She wanted to remind them that people like her had the power, that a simple phone call could put them in their place. that no matter how many promotions James earned, how much success they built, their blackness would always make them suspicious in her eyes. But Karen had no idea who she was dealing with, and in just a few minutes, when those officers arrived, she was going to learn a lesson she'd never forget. Have you ever witnessed or experienced something like this? How did you handle it? Share your story in the comments. The tension in the air was suffocating. James stood tall, his expression unreadable, as Karen clutched her phone, pacing anxiously. Her eyes flicked toward the entrance of the park every few seconds, as if she were counting down the moments until the police arrived. Lisa wrapped an arm around Ava, pulling her close. Malik stood stiffly beside her, his small hands balled into nervous fists. Their fun afternoon had turned into something ugly, something Lisa had feared, but never wanted her children to witness firsthand. James exhaled slowly. He could already hear the sirens in the distance. They were coming. The other families in the park had begun to take notice. Conversations hushed. Parents pulled their children a little closer, not wanting to get involved, but unable to look away. Some had their phones out, recording, knowing exactly where this could go. And then, 2 squad cars rolled up. The blue and red lights flashed against the backdrop of the sunny afternoon, a jarring contrast to the warmth of the day. 2 uniformed officers stepped out, their hands resting near their holsters as they took in the scene. One was a young white officer with a buzz cut, the other an older Latino officer with a weathered face. Karen immediately rushed toward them, her face contorted into the perfect expression of distress. "Oh, thank God you're here," she gasped, clutching her chest as if she had narrowly escaped danger. She pointed dramatically toward James and his family. "They've been harassing people, acting aggressive. I was terrified. I don't even know if they're supposed to be here." Lisa's breath hitched. That word. Aggressive. She knew exactly what Karen was doing. She was playing into the oldest, most dangerous lie there was, that a black man standing his ground was a threat. The younger officer's eyes flicked toward James, assessing him. His hand hovered a little closer to his holster. Lisa's stomach dropped. The older officer stepped forward. "Sir, we got a complaint about some suspicious activity," he said, his tone cautious but firm. James didn't flinch. He had been in this position before. His movements were slow, deliberate, non-threatening. "I think you'll want to take a look at this." James reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, flipping it open to reveal his gold police badge. For a second, there was silence. The younger officer frowned, stepping closer to get a better look. His expression shifted from suspicion to something else entirely. "Wait," he breathed, his posture straightening. "You're—" The older officer blinked, then immediately stepped back, eyes widening. "Chief Johnson?" Lisa exhaled a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Karen's smirk faltered. Her head snapped toward James, then back to the officers, confusion flickering across her face. "What?" she blurted out, her voice sharp with disbelief. That's impossible. He's lying." The older officer squared his shoulders, his stance shifting into something more respectful. "No, ma'am, he's not lying. This is Chief James Johnson." Karen staggered back. Her mouth opened, then closed, like she was searching for a way to bend reality itself. Lisa let out a short, incredulous laugh. Karen had called the cops on the chief of police. The younger officer swallowed hard. "Sir, we didn't realize—" James cut him off with a raised hand. He wasn't about to let them backpedal. His voice was calm, but sharp. "That's the problem, isn't it?" he said. Karen was still reeling, her face a storm of emotions, shock, embarrassment, anger. But James wasn't done. "This is exactly what I've been fighting against," he continued. "You saw us, assumed the worst, and weaponized the police against my family. You wanted us to be humiliated, or worse." Karen's face burned red. I was just looking out for the neighborhood," Lisa snapped. You mean you were uncomfortable seeing a black family happy? She shot back. Because that's the only thing we were doing. Karen whirled toward the officers, still searching for a way to win. I don't care if he's the police chief. That doesn't mean he should be here making people uncomfortable. James let out a slow, controlled breath. The only one making people uncomfortable, he said evenly, is you. The officers exchanged a look. Then the older officer turned toward Karen, his voice suddenly much cooler. Actually, Mum, you're the one causing a disturbance. Karen's head snapped up. What? She hissed, her voice sharp with indignation. You're joking! I'm the one who called you. They're the problem. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. Ma'am, we responded to a call about a dangerous situation. There was none. The older officer nodded. Which means this was a false report. Karen's breath hitched. Her eyes darted wildly between them, realization dawning. No, you don't understand. I felt threatened. They were... James took a step closer, his voice dropping to something dangerously low. What exactly did we do to threaten you? He asked. Karen's mouth opened. Nothing came out, because she had nothing, because there had never been a threat, just her own entitlement. Lisa crossed her arms. You should be ashamed of yourself. Karen turned back to the officers. I just wanted to keep the park safe, she tried again, her voice cracking. I was scared. The older officer sighed. Ma'am, you're going to need to come with us. Karen's face drained of color. What? She breathed. No! You can't do this. I'm the victim. James turned to his children. Malik was still clutching his mother's arm, eyes big with uncertainty. He knelt in front of his son, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. I want you to remember this moment, Malik, James said gently. Because this is why I do what I do. So one day, people like her won't have the power to make us feel small. Malik nodded slowly, his little jaw tightening with understanding. Karen was still protesting as the officers guided her toward the squad car. This is ridiculous, she shrieked. You're going to regret this. I was only trying to help. But the only thing she received in response was silence. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse. Some people shook their heads. Others murmured to each other. But there was one undeniable truth in the air. Karen had called the police to assert her power. Instead, she had exposed herself. And justice was finally catching up to her. A hush had fallen over the park, but the weight of unspoken words lingered in the air. Karen's face was still twisted in indignation, her mind racing for an escape. Surely someone would defend her. Someone in this park, one of the good, decent people, would step forward and say that she had a point. But no one did. Instead, the silence was broken by an unexpected voice. I've lived in this neighborhood for 50 years, an elderly woman said, stepping forward. She was small but formidable, her silver hair pinned back neatly. The deep lines on her face carried the weight of decades of wisdom. Karen's eyes widened. Mrs. Peterson. Mrs. Peterson nodded sharply. And let me tell you something, Karen, she said, her voice unwavering. They are welcome here. You? Not so much. Karen's mouth dropped open. Mrs. Peterson shook her head in disappointment. I've seen a lot of change in this neighborhood. Some good, some bad. But people like you? You're the real problem. You always have been. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Then another voice joined in. She's right. A young white couple holding hands stepped forward. The woman's face was tight with frustration. We see you harassing them all the time, Karen. It's disgusting. It needs to stop. The man beside her nodded. You act like you own this place, but we all live here. It's not just yours. Karen stumbled back. Her gaze darted around desperately. She had expected support. What she got was rejection. More murmurs rose from the crowd. A few people, black, white, Latino, nodded in agreement. Karen had spent years making herself the self-appointed gatekeeper of the neighborhood. But today, the neighborhood turned its back on her. Lisa, still holding Ava close, let out a quiet breath. For years, she had felt like she was fighting this battle alone, like people saw what was happening but chose to stay silent. But now they were speaking up. Karen's face turned red. I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe, she blurted, her voice cracking. Is that such a crime? The younger officer pulled out his notepad. Actually, ma'am, making a false police report is a crime. Karen gasped. Wait. What? The officer kept his expression neutral, though there was an unmistakable edge to his voice. We're going to need to document this incident. Karen whipped around to James. You can't let them do this. You're the chief, aren't you? Do something. James exhaled sharply and shook his head. No, he said, his voice firm. You were trying to use the police as your personal enforcers. That's not happening anymore. Karen staggered backward, her entire world crashing down around her. For the first time, she had no power. For the first time, her call to the police hadn't worked in her favor. For the first time, she was being held accountable. And the worst part, no one was coming to save her. Karen's breath came in short, ragged gasps as the officers stared her down. The weight of the moment crashed over her like a tidal wave. This is ridiculous, she stammered, clutching her purse like a lifeline. You can't do this. I was just scared. The younger officer, who had initially looked at James with suspicion, shook his head. His expression had changed. You weren't scared, he said coldly. You were entitled. Karen flinched. And it's time people like you face the consequences. Her hands trembled as she turned to James. Her eyes were wide now, desperate. You're not actually going to arrest me, are you? She asked, her voice shaking. James let out a small, dry chuckle. She still thought she had power over him. Oh, I'm not, he said, his voice cool and steady. But I am filing a report. Karen's face drained of color. No, this isn't right. I called you. I was the one who felt unsafe. The older officer didn't blink. And we responded. We determined that there was no threat. And now we're handling the real issue. Karen's breathing grew erratic. She turned to the watching crowd, pleading now. Are you really going to let them do this to me? She cried. I was just trying to help. I was trying to protect our neighborhood. No one spoke. No one moved. They just stared back at her, unmoved. For years, Karen had gotten away with this. Spinning lies, manipulating the system, using her whiteness as both a weapon and a shield. But now, the system was turning on her. James turned to the officers. Make sure she doesn't try this again, he said, because next time she will be arrested. Karen's lip quivered. You can't do this to me, she whispered. You can't. James tilted his head. Why not? For a split second, Karen had no answer, because deep down she knew she had done this to herself. Finally, she let out a frustrated, humiliated growl. With a sharp pivot, she spun on her heel and stormed off. The crowd, which had been silent before, erupted into cheers. Some clapped, others shook James's hand. About time, someone muttered. Lisa let out a slow breath, gripping James's hand tightly. Malik and Ava clung to her, eyes still wide with everything they had witnessed. James knelt down to their level. You okay, buddy? He asked Malik. The boy hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, you didn't let her win. James smiled. That's right. Then Lisa spoke, her voice softer now, but firm. That's why we keep fighting. James stood, taking in the sight of his family, his neighbors, the community that had stood by him. Karen had tried to make them feel small. But today, they had stood tall. The echoes of Karen's departure still lingered in the air, but the tension she had brought with her was gone. Now, in its place, there was something else. Relief, strength, unity. James let out a slow breath before kneeling down to his children's level. Malik and Ava stood close, still processing everything they had just witnessed. Their little faces were full of questions. Questions James knew he'd have to answer in different ways as they grew older. But for now, he held their gaze and spoke softly, firmly. "I want you both to remember something," he said. "Never let people like that make you feel small. You belong wherever you go." Malik nodded, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. Ava hesitated for a moment before wrapping her arms around her father's neck. James hugged her tight, feeling the weight of the moment settle deep in his chest. Lisa stepped forward, her eyes glossy but steady. She rested a hand on James's shoulder, then leaned in and kissed his forehead. "You handled that with more patience than I ever could," she murmured. James exhaled softly. "I've had practice." Lisa hugged him, holding him close. It wasn't just love in her embrace, it was gratitude, not just for how he had handled Karen, but for how he had protected their family, how he had stood tall, unwavering, in the face of something that could have easily gone wrong. Nearby, the officers who had responded stood awkwardly, their previous tension replaced with visible discomfort. The older officer cleared his throat. "Chief, He hesitated, then sighed. "We've got a lot of work to do, but we're with you." James stood and met the officer's gaze. He had worked alongside men like him before, officers who weren't necessarily bad people, but had been shaped by a broken system. James gave him a small, measured nod. "Then let's get to work." The officer nodded back. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step in the right direction, and sometimes change started with just that, a single step. As the officers returned to their cars, the park seemed to breathe again. Someone turned up the music. The scent of grilled food filled the air once more. Children laughed, conversations restarted. And then, one by one, more neighbors, black, white, and everything in between, joined the BBQ. A man James recognized from down the street walked over. "Mind if we grab a plate?" he asked with a grin. Lisa laughed. "Go ahead, but don't think you're leaving without helping clean up." The man chuckled as he grabbed a plate. "Fair enough." Mrs. Peterson sat at a nearby picnic table, shaking her head as she unwrapped a napkin. "I can't believe it took this long for someone to finally put that woman in her place," she muttered, taking a bite of potato salad. James chuckled as he flipped another set of burgers on the grill. This moment, this small act of unity, was something Karen could never take away. Because community was stronger than hate. And though the fight for justice was far from over, moments like this, they proved that change was possible. What would you do in this situation? Tell us in the comments.